For the first time in what feels like years, a foreign language film has managed to gain widestream attention from the West. Parasite is a masterfully made film, directed by Bong Joon-ho. Much like the majority of his film, it's a film about social class and division, with protagonists that are on the lower rungs of the social ladder and are at odds with individuals and institutions which keep them there. It may not be as hotly discussed as Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, but the fact that this film is getting so much attention in the West, especially in the USA, is not only a positive sign that audiences are still willing to engage with foreign cinema, but it also means they have an opportunity to see a really great film about class struggle, especially since the potential conversations around Joker were monopolized by media outlets which led people to believe that it was a pro-incel movie. Parasite explores how those who are talented, academically gifted, creative, and physically capable aren't always properly rewarded for their ability, as many claim that a capitalist society should do. Because of that, the message of Parasite is almost universal in the West and the East. The Kim family live in abject poverty. They're at the mercy of the gig economy, jobs that are often very short term with little to no benefits included, and usually very low paying. They're a family of intelligent and talented people. The son Ki-woo is academically gifted, the daughter is an artistic and shrewd person, the father Ki-taek is wise, and the mother Chung-suk was a champion shot putter. On the other side of the spectrum, the Parks are an extremely wealthy and privileged family. Mr. Park is the owner of a tech company who doesn't spend much time with his family. Mrs. Park is a stay-at-home mother who is well-kept, superstitious, and perpetually bored, and lets her housekeeper do much of the child rearing. Their daughter is a complacent teen who doesn't place much value on education, and their son is a toddler who seems to have attention issues, but it's never confirmed. It's clear that the Kim family would never be able to get a foot in the door to work for the Park family without some help. Ki-woo is only able to get a job as a tutor for the Park's daughter because his wealthy friend passes the job on to him, an example of how obtaining employment for the underprivileged can often be a case of who you know. After ingratiating himself with the family, Ki-woo is able to use this same method to get his family jobs with the Parks. However, this is at the expense of the Park's current employees. This is where some of the elements of Parasite's class warfare are introduced. The film isn't simply the Kims versus the Parks, it's about the Kims having to fight against other working class people in order to satisfy their need for income. The Kims' methods to replace the Parks' current employees are unscrupulous and without compassion. It's a microcosm of the dog-eat-dog nature of capitalism, which engenders a system in which if someone wins, there has to be a loser, and the loser pays dearly for their loss. It's easy to see the Kim family as being despicable for getting the Park's employees fired in such an underhanded way, and to an extent it is appalling, but they are still trying to survive and taking advantage of an opportunity for stable employment, which none of them have had in a very long time. However, as securing wealth goes, it's worth considering that this is something that happens on a larger scale far more frequently, such as large corporations who lay off thousands of employees to secure profits despite reporting record earnings. The framing of the two family classes within the film are made apparent throughout. The Kims live deep within the lowest level of the city in an apartment in the basement of a large building, surrounded by clutter in confined spaces. The Parks live atop the city in a house designed by an architect that once lived there, with large windows in which sunlight can enter and they can see the world below them. It's as though they're gods living on Mount Olympus, and those below them have to appease them any way that they can in order to gain their favor. However, much like the gods, the Parks are oblivious to the worship they receive and how the actions of mankind benefit them. When Gyun-se is discovered hiding in the bunker to hide from loan sharks, we learn that he quite literally worships Mr. Kim, having created a makeshift shrine in his honor in the belief that his faith and devotion in him will reward him in time, and this continued existence is contingent on his blessing, despite not knowing that Gyun-se lives in a house or even exists. Other than shelter, Gyun-se receives nothing from the Park family, but he feels the need to appease them. After he's tied up during the altercation with the Kims, he hears Mr. Park walking up a staircase, and Gyun-se switches on the lights as he ascends. Mr. Park does not know that this is the work of a person. He believes that simply this is how the world works around him, that there is no human endeavor behind the things that make life more convenient for him. If you were to compare this to Greek mythology once again, this could possibly be likened to the myth of Sisyphus, where he pushes a boulder up the mountain over and over again to gain the favor of Zeus. It's a loose analogy, but I think it's somewhat appropriate. As real-life parallels go, the Kims, Moon-gwang, and Gyeon-se appeasing the Parks is much like the modern-day worship of billionaires and the belief that their possession of vast sums of wealth will eventually benefit the world, that they're the ones who are smart enough to make decisions which will determine the future of our world, and how allowing them to keep that wealth will inevitably lead to better, more stable jobs, better technology, and higher standards of living, and how the philanthropy will fix things like homelessness, education, healthcare, poverty, or even existential threats like climate change. But the fact is that people like the Parks, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Warren Buffett, etc., etc., if they really wanted to fix the major problems that affect our everyday life or even cared about the average person, they would have already done something significant already. As of 2018, it was estimated that there are 553,000 people living homeless in the US. According to Matthew Chapman, Jeff Bezos has enough money to buy every one of them a $200,000 house and still have $19.2 billion left over, which would still make him one of the 25 richest men in the world. Billionaires will not save you. People like Mr. Park won't help, Gyun-se. If they were inclined to be so gracious or generous, the Park family could solve Gyun-se and Moon-gwang's financial problems immediately, and still have plenty left over. Not only do they choose not to help people like him, they go out of their way to ignore their problems. And not only do the Parks have disdain for the poor, they fetishize them too. In a scene where the Parks are out of town for a camping trip, the entire Kim family stays at their house to enjoy their food and various amenities. This is also when they're discovered to be frauds by Moon-gwang and Gyun-se. Chung-suk, as their housekeeper, is the only person who's supposed to be there looking after the place, but after the Parks call to tell her that they're coming back early, the Kims are caught off guard and they can't escape before they arrive. They hide under the coffee table, and the Park's son, who is disappointed that their trip came to an end early, is allowed to stay on the lawn in a tent, and his parents sleep on the couch in the living room as the Kims are stuck under the table still. Earlier in the film, the Kim's daughter got a ride home from the Park's old driver. Yeo-jeong left her underwear in the back seat, so Mr. Park will later find them and fire him, believing that he's been using his car to hook up with women. While the Kims are trapped under the table, Mr. and Mrs. Park discuss them. Mr. Park mentions Ki-taek's odor, saying that he can still smell it and how it reminds him of old radish or boiled rags. However, Mrs. Park isn't able to detect the same smell, implying that Mr. Park can detect and is disgusted by someone working class. They start to become intimate, and while they're doing so, they begin to roleplay poor people. Mr. Park fantasizes Mrs. Park is wearing Ki-jeong's dirty underwear, and Mrs. Park asks him to buy her drugs, which the implication is that she's a sex worker performing sexual favors for drugs. Watching the Kims having to endure through this deeply uncomfortable moment where they realize that the Parks disturbingly romanticize their lives with no understanding of their struggle. Humiliation can often be a byproduct of remaining in the workplace though. Consider what people who work in service industries have to put up with. Customer service workers who have to listen to complaints and even insults because the company they work for have policies that aren't consumer friendly, or even waitresses having to put up with unwanted advances and flirting from diners in order to get a decent tip because their employer doesn't pay them a livable wage. After the Kims escape, they head back home as torrential rain pours down. They walk the entire way, and we see that every step of their journey is a descent, and the water follows with them, mixing with all the dirt and the sewage. When they arrive home, they discover that their apartment has been completely flooded and most of their belongings have been destroyed. They spend the night in a gymnasium with scores of other people who live in the lower parts of the city who have also been victims of the flood. At this point, Ki-taek admits that everything that people do is meaningless, that there's no point in making plans or trying because things will always go wrong for people like him and his family. His son, who has recovered the Scholar's Rock from his apartment, still grasps onto it, saying that it won't leave him, Given its weight and how cumbersome it is, it could be an implication that his desire for material wealth and success is a burden that he can't let go of. The next day, when the Parks hold a birthday party for their son, the Kims are invited as employees. They use the opportunity to deal with Gyun-se and Moon-gwang, who are still in the bunker. Ki-woo heads down there with the Scholar's Rock to finish them off, almost as though he's learned that in order to succeed, he needs to be ruthless. He's caught off guard by Gyun-se, who takes the Scholar's Rock and brutally strikes Ki-woo on the head with it, which we later learn gives him permanent brain damage. Gyun-se then escapes the bunker and heads towards a party with the intent of killing the rest of the Kim family. Before this happens, we see Mr. Park and Ki-taek hiding behind the bushes waiting to perform a skit for the party while dressed in some unfortunate cultural appropriation, but if you'll bear with me, I'll explain why that has some sort of purpose. As they're waiting, Ki-taek begins to connect with Mr. Park as he's done on numerous occasions, remarking on how he must truly love his family if he's willing to do things like this for them. For a moment, it seems as though Ki-taek has managed to break through the barrier of their employer/employee relationship, but the status quo remains intact, and Mr. Park reminds Ki-taek once again that he is his employer, and that he's paying him extra to be there, so he shouldn't talk to him like that. Gyun-se enters the party, stabs Ki-jeong in the chest, and the Park son has a seizure. Mr. Park rushes to take his child away from the chaos, as the Kims struggle against Gyun-se's frenzy. After he's overpowered by Chung-suk, Ki-taek throws the car keys at Mr. Park but misses, and they end up beneath Gyun-se. As he lays on the ground injured, Mr. Park moves to him to retrieve the keys but recoils in disgust at his odor. Gyun-se greets Mr. Park, this figure who is worshipped for the longest time, and he replies, "Do I know you?" Ki-taek witnesses all this. Mr. Park's indifference to the Kim family's struggle, his ignorance of who Gyun-se is, and his familiar look of disgust. Mr. Park sees the poor much like how American settlers saw the Native Americans, less than human. The natives struggle to survive against the tyranny of those more powerful than them. Ki-taek's daughter lies dying on the ground, his son gravely wounded, and his wife slashed. The Kims, Gyun-se, and Moon-gwang competed against each other ruthlessly to appease the Parks, but it was all for nothing. After this epiphany, Ki-taek grabs a knife, runs at Mr. Park, and stabs him in the chest, inevitably killing him. He realizes that he shouldn't fight against people like Gyun-se that struggle just as much as he and his family do, and ultimately people like Mr. Park who decide upon the fate of the working class every day are the problem. That they not only fail to see their struggle, they actively choose not to. We later learn that Ki-woo survived his injury, albeit with a disorder that makes him laugh uncontrollably at times, as though their troubles are just a joke. Ki-jeong has died and Ki-taek is stuck in a bunker where Gyun-se once lived to avoid the police. So Ki-woo and Chung-suk are left to fend for themselves, once again resorting to gig jobs in order to survive, and after paying various legal fees and hospital fees, it's safe to assume that they're in the same place that they were in the beginning, or even worse. Ki-woo visits the Park's old house, which they've sold to a German family. He looks at it from a distance and notices a flickering light, which turns out to be Ki-taek communicating in Morse code to whoever might see it. He tells him that he's managing to survive and living off the food that he can find in the household. Ki-woo writes a letter back to his father, vowing that he's going to become rich and successful so that he can one day buy the house so that his dad can finally climb the stairs out of the bunker and be free. We see him in the future having accomplished his goal and him reuniting with his dad. However, this is revealed to be a fantasy, ending the film on a shot of Ki-woo in the basement apartment, in the darkness, looking into the camera with tears in his eyes and the implication that this will never happen. The film puts across the message that talent or academic prowess might be a contributor to success within a capitalist society, but it's not a guarantee. It might be the case that Mr. Park built himself up from nothing or very little. The film doesn't say whether this is the case, but it's safe to assume that at some point in his life he had the capital to help him create his business, therefore helping him accumulate more wealth. Regardless of how he did build himself up, Mr. Park is a staunch defender of the status quo and maintains his distance from the lower classes. Ki-taek strikes up numerous conversations with Mr. Kim, but when he starts to connect with him on a more personal level, Mr. Park shuts him down and reminds Ki-taek that he's no more than an employee and shouldn't be engaging with him on this level. Mr. Park refuses to see Ki-taek as nothing more than a tool to fulfill a role. Developing any empathy with him not only acknowledges him as a human being, but someone who has their own struggles, and how people like the Park family are responsible for that. Mr. Park's remarks on how he's disgusted by Ki-taek's odor and his reaction to Gyun-se's signify an implicit aversion to someone of his class, a natural disdain for them. Much like many people in the real world, the Kims, Gyun-se and Moon-gwang believe that appeasing to those who hold the majority of wealth will bring them rewards, that eventually they can climb the ladder and perhaps even become like them, but it's apparent that the system is rigged against them, that their daily struggles are ignored by the wealthy, and this is by all means intentional. The Park family do not empathize with the Kims, despite them mistakenly believing that they do. In a way, by the end, Ki-woo has learned a lesson, that their struggle is futile, that the only thing they can really do is survive. The Kims attain some level of class consciousness by realizing that they're being exploited for their labor, but Ki-woo still understands that the only way they can escape this or even be free of their individual struggle is if they somehow attain wealth. But the film makes this clear that the odds of this happening are almost non-existent. What Parasite puts forward is that class warfare doesn't just happen between the poor and the wealthy, but within the same classes. The Kims fight ruthlessly against the Park's employees, adopting tactics which are underhanded but necessary in order to achieve their goals. The film says that survival among the lower classes is contingent on other people within that group losing as others win. In the end, when Ki-taek murders Mr. Park, he has finally rejected the notion that his enemies aren't those who struggle much like his family, but those who put them in a position where they have to struggle, the wealthy that ensure their interests are secured by exploiting the working class, both financially and through dehumanization. However, by rejecting the status quo, Ki-taek pays dearly, because he still lives in a world where the majority of people in the world haven't attained class consciousness and aren't willing to fight or even question their oppressors. The Kims sacrificed a great deal to achieve this realization, but despite all this, they're still at the whim of a capitalist society which doesn't care about them. They still need to survive, and they're still doomed to face the financial setbacks over and over again for the rest of their lives, in hopes that someday they'll get another chance to live a better, more comfortable life. A day that rarely ever comes for people like the Kims. Thank you very much for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video. I love Parasite. It's easily my favorite film of 2019. If you haven't seen any of Bong Joon-ho's other movies, I highly recommend you watch them. There's The Host, Mother, Snowpiercer, and Okja. All great movies. I guarantee you'll love them if you liked Parasite. If you could do all the typical YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, etc., I would really appreciate it. It helps me out a lot. But otherwise, I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you next time. Alright? Bye bye.